Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. This is the 5th entry in a series of videos in which I review and discuss each and every Warlord and associated signature squad that we've seen released thus far. And today I'll be focusing on the highlights and lowlights on the very first Dark Eldar faction Warlord. Keep in mind that although at this point we've seen the release of all 6 of the different war packs of the Warlord cycle, in this video I'm only going to be covering the card synergy present within the core set itself, although in later videos I'll be covering our other core Warlords, the non-signature cards for each faction from the core set, and eventually I'll cover the different war packs of the Warlord cycle as well. But for now, let's see what the very first of our Dark Eldar Warlords has to offer. She is Packmaster Kith, with the Warrior, Succubus, and Witch traits, a starting hand size of 7 and 7 starting resource tokens, and her text reads, Reaction. After this Warlord commits to a planet, put a Chimera token into play at this planet. And because these are going to come up frequently throughout the video, Chimeras are 2 attack, 1 hit point, creature trait tokens that Packmaster Kith tends to see in abundance. Because of these tokens, not only does Packmaster Kith have a respectably high attack value for a Warlord, but in a sense, she has a greater capacity for damage output, at least in a solo sense, than does any other core set Warlord, simply because if you and your opponent happen to deploy your Warlords to the same planet, all other things being equal, and not having any other units present, you'll be able to leverage all the more attack power up front in your favor, particularly if it just so happens that you're the one holding that initiative token. As we cover this first Dark Eldar Warlord and take a look at many of the Dark Eldar faction cards, sacrificing units as part of a cost required to benefit from their effects is definitely a theme that we're going to see throughout, and this Warlord's ability to put a token into play each and every round can not only help you to win battles and better control the battlefield, but also provides an expendable unit round after round that you can potentially give up in order to benefit from what can be some immensely powerful effects. Probably the biggest downfall of the relatively straightforward Packmaster Kith is that if it just so happens that she does become bloodied, she loses so much of her utility, because not only are you no longer putting those tokens into play each and every turn, but your attack value drops, and you're left with a pretty paltry 5 hit points between you and losing the game. For that reason, I think it's of the utmost importance that you do your absolute best to protect Packmaster Kith, not only through using the occasional shield card, but also through leveraging effects like the Dark Eldar event Archon's Terror, which could not only serve the benefit of returning hard-hitting, expensive, and resilient enemy units to your opponent's headquarters, so long as they're not unique, but it could also be used to target less expensive, but still dangerous units that have been loaded up with any number of deadly and potentially game-changing attachments. And in addition, it's possible that you could use Blackheart Ravager to also send some of your opponent's powerful units packing. And although you'll likely want to make the most out of those Chimera tokens that the Packmaster is putting into play, In taking a look at her signature squad, we're later going to be discussing a support that allows you to shift those between planets, so you need not necessarily jeopardize the safety of your Warlord just in order to get those potentially high damage output tokens exactly where you need them to be. All in all, there isn't much else to say about Packmaster Kith. She's relatively straightforward in that she has the potential for high damage output. She puts those relatively dangerous, albeit fragile tokens into play, turn after turn, and whether you choose to sacrifice those, have them sponge up enemy attacks, or simply have them attempt to inflict as much punishment as possible upon your opponent, I think a lot of those decisions are going to be dictated based upon what other signature or otherwise complementary cards you happen to draw. But in any case, as we move on to the first of Kith's signature squad, we receive a 2-cost army unit that reinforces that pack mentality and swarm playstyle all the more in Kith's Chimera Masters, with 1 command icon, 1 attack value, and 2 hit points, the Warrior, Beastmaster, and Witch traits, and reaction. After this unit enters play, put a Chimera token into play at this planet. So, strikingly similar to Kith being committed to a planet and putting a token unit into play, the deploy phase is typically when you're going to be seeing army units entering play, and in this case, you end up getting 2 bodies for the price of 1. So even though a 1 command icon 1/2 might not seem like much of a bargain for that 2 resource investment, being able to derive all the more benefit from a 2/1 token unit makes this card all the more worthwhile. As with any low hit point unit, these Chimera Masters and the tokens that they put into play are exceptionally vulnerable to area effect type attacks and any kind of damage that targets multiple units at one time. So, given the relative frailty and vulnerability of the Chimera Masters and those Chimera tokens, many of the same protective measures you might implement in order to protect Packmaster Kith would serve fantastically well in a pinch to preserve any of your swarming, individually fragile, token and army units. So not just the expensive Blackheart Ravager that I mentioned earlier, or the event Archon's Terror, both cards that provide the at times invaluable ability to rout any enemy army unit, but also somewhat simpler and more straightforward effects like ranged units, which not only the Dark Eldar, but additionally their Eldar allies have in spades. For instance, the Baleful Mandrake or Eldar Altansar Rangers, which attack for 3 or 2 respectively, or even the extraordinarily inexpensive Dark Eldar Sybarite Marksman, which, although it's much more frail, so long as you're able to act during that ranged skirmish, particularly if you can deploy attachments to any of these ranged attackers, if routing isn't an option, you could nevertheless pick off some of those problematic area effect or exceptionally dangerous enemy units posing a threat to either your Warlord or pack as a whole. But given that hopefully you aren't going to have to run up to many area effect units, as there aren't really that many contained within the core set, by merit of essentially putting 2 units into play for the cost of 1, you not only get additional fodder units to sacrifice if the need arises, but you can also stomach additional attacks from the enemy before you run out of attack power. So even if you don't have the initiative token, you can nevertheless end up dealing at least a single point of damage to an enemy unit, even if they get to act first and dispatch the Chimera token that this less dangerous attacker puts into play. You'll get at least one opportunity to attack, if not two, unless your opponent can leverage some sort of nasty tricks of their own against you. Important to note as we see our card pool eventually expand is that this reaction triggers after this unit enters play, not when it's deployed from your hand. And considering that not only does this army unit put into play what can prove to be exceptionally dangerous tokens, but that it can easily win command struggles and defend planets for you, help you to establish an even greater board presence, this seems to be an utterly spectacular value for that 2 resource cost. Just as I mentioned the possibility of leveraging the ranged skirmish round in your favor in order to protect not only your Packmaster but also your hordes and swarm of Chimera tokens and other low-cost Dark Eldar units, one attachment that could be put to fantastic effect is the next card in Packmaster's signature squad, the Agonizer of Bren, which although you only receive 1 copy is, for 1 cost, a 3 shield value attachment with the war gear and weapon traits that reads attached to an army unit. Attached unit gets +1 attack for each Chimera token you control. So even though the consistency with which you'll end up ultimately drawing this attachment isn't there, again, considering that it's only 1 copy in your deck, and that the attack value it confers could vary wildly from game to game depending on how many Chimera tokens you manage to not only put, but keep in play, this nevertheless does have the potential of elevating particularly some of those ranged units to immense heights of attack power, and if you're able to leverage events in your favor, it could potentially be pretty easy for you to keep those in play in the battlefield. For instance, if your opponent has the initiative token and ranged attackers of their own, you could use Archon's Terror to make sure that they aren't able to snipe whatever army unit you affix the Agonizer to. Or, if they don't have a ranged attacker, or you're the one with the initiative token, you could potentially spare innumerable Chimera and other units from potentially devastating area effects. If you're able to derive even a paltry benefit from this attachment, you could nevertheless destroy the likes of a vicious Bloodletter or other immensely dangerous units with only the smallest amount of preparation on your part. Even the enormously fragile Sybarite marksman could become enormously powerful with this card, if you do happen to have several of those tokens kept in play. And at the very least, you could nevertheless deploy this in a pinch to reap a tremendous benefit from that enormous shield value. Really, probably the biggest weakness of this attachment is that the Dark Eldar quite simply don't have access to very many high hit point army units, not only within their own faction, but also looking to their Eldar and Chaos allies as well. The Khorne Berserker is probably the absolute most resilient target that you could affix this attachment to, and as it might not end up being the most valuable army unit in a Dark Eldar deck, even though the Khorne Berserker has the brutal keyword, I really can't see an opponent playing against Kith feeding into that keyword. I think it's all the more likely that you're going to have a large number of Chimera tokens in play, or simply inexpensive, cheap, and resultingly fragile units on the battlefield that your opponent's probably much more likely to pick off one by one, as opposed to putting 2 or maybe 3 points of damage onto your Khorne Berserker and really kicking its attack value into high gear, whether or not you ultimately affix the Agonizer to it or not. I think probably the best use for this card is attaching it to a Baleful Mandrake or Altansar Rangers, if for no other reason than they're having one command icon, so that maybe you can deploy that unit alone to a planet potentially winning command struggles, and at the same time, keeping it relatively safe from harassment from the enemy warlord, just because you'd be able to hit very hard during that range skirmish round, and potentially pose a serious threat to your opponent's most valuable unit. I don't necessarily think that this is going to win many games for you, and it might not end up making a huge effect on the outcome of many games, but nevertheless, if you do draw this card, it does have significant defensive and offensive value. And as one final means of preserving whatever unit happens to have this attachment, I'll just mention that in order to protect all of your units, another useful means of curbing some of your opponent's tricks might be the 2-cost support Twisted Laboratory, which can provide the situationally tremendous benefit of removing any unpleasant card text from an opposing unit. So if you're able to shut down their ranged or area effect units, that single support could ultimately prove to make a tremendous difference. And, on the topic of supports, up next we have the 1-cost support, Chimera Den, with the location trait and the text Action. Exhaust this support to move any number of Chimera tokens you control to a target planet. Which, although this is only a single card in your deck, could make an incredible difference as to the outcome of a game. Not only can this serve the benefit of concentrating as many or as few Chimera tokens onto one target planet as you'd like, but it allows you the incredible opportunity to use and abuse action windows to your advantage to not just potentially win battles, but in many cases absolutely devastate your opponent. Important to note, the Chimera tokens can be pulled from any planet on the board or your headquarters, and they arrive in whatever state they were in prior to their moving. So if you have up to the maximum of 10 Chimera tokens, you can wait until the final action window of a given combat round when all of your opponent's army units are exhausted, and you could arrive with up to 10 Chimera tokens, each able to attack for a potentially lethal 2, for a grand total of what could be an enormous 20 damage distributed amongst any number of enemy units on that planet. So not only can you have one absolutely immense tidal wave of damage flooding out and destroying your opposing army, but at the end of that combat round, all of those Chimera refresh, and then you treat it like any other combat, albeit considering that all of a sudden you have a tremendously bolstered number of units present, and at that point they can not only attack, but they have to soak up attacks as well, which can turn what may have been a decisive victory for your opponent into, even if not a devastating loss, into a grueling slog of a combat, costing your opponent dearly. Considering that one of the only downfalls of these Chimera tokens is that area effect units might obliterate them en masse, if you wait to trigger this support until your opponent's area effect units have already acted, then this allows you a fantastic opportunity to not only dodge that bullet, but also pick off those offending units so that they can't pose any threat to you for the remainder of that game. if you do manage to get this support into play, it can make it enormously difficult for you to lose battles, in that you can leverage this effect in your favor each and every game round. And if you are so fortunate as to see this exceptionally inexpensive support put into play in the early game, it can make establishing a foothold against your opponent exceptionally easy and make achieving victory in the Traxxas sector absolutely trivial in difficulty. The earlier you can start winning planets, the earlier you can eliminate enemy units, the more command struggles you're going to win, the more battle effects of planets you're going to trigger, and all the easier ultimately attaining victory becomes. Really, the only pitfalls of this card is that between activations, all of your tokens that you choose to round up have to be placed at one planet, which potentially exposes them to falling victim to board clearing effects like Exterminatus. But if you're moving them from your headquarters, can also have the potential benefit of protecting them from the powerful Eldar event Doom. Really, though, I think one of the only significant pitfalls of this card is the tremendous inconsistency with which you'll draw this, and really the only other thing I can think of to mention is to make absolute certain that, if you are focusing your Chimera tokens at one planet for any reason or through any number of different effects, you should make absolute certain that under no circumstance do you let your opponent win a battle at Aatrox Prime, just because all it takes to clear the board of these potentially devastating tokens is a single point of damage. But beyond being an enormously powerful support in and of itself, there are several different cards that synergize to a fantastic sense with this card. Not only our Warlord and Kith's Chimera Masters that we've already covered, but additionally the Beast Hunter Witches, which, although expensive at costing 3 resources to put into play, allow you to expend 1 resource token after each and every Dark Eldar event that you play in order to generate a Chimera token at your headquarters. And even though those would have to commit to planets alongside your Warlord under normal circumstances, remember that with a Chimera Den, you do not have to play by those rules. And if you're able to deploy multiple copies of that army unit, you can potentially, although it quickly becomes very expensive, generate multiple Chimera per event, although there does of course remain that limit of 1 token per army unit per triggering event. But if resources are not a problem for you, or you simply opt to do this over several game rounds, Colosseum Fighters can add even more fuel to that fire in allowing you to return events to your hand, to play again, to create even more tokens. And whether it's through using a swarm of Chimera tokens or any number of other units and card abilities to decimate your opponent's army, if you do manage to pick off all of their weak, frail, vulnerable, fragile individual units and leave nothing but expensive, resilient, hard-hitting, and normally extraordinarily dangerous units left, one of those events you might want to consider including in your deck is Power from Pain, because if you leave your opponent with nothing but expensive units left to sacrifice, you could potentially derive enormous value from what could otherwise at times be a relatively ineffectual event. But on to the final piece of the Packmaster Kith Signature Squad and Chimera Token Synergy. We have 2 copies of the 2-cost event, Pact of the Homunculi, with 1 shield icon, the tactic trait, and reading deploy action. Sacrifice a unit to discard 1 card at random from your opponent's hand. Then draw 2 cards. So immediately upon assessing this event, card advantage is always a good thing. So if you're at a surplus of resources, being able to invest a couple of those in order to draw 2 additional cards could, in and of itself, be a fantastic value. But this has the additional benefit of forcing your opponent to discard a card, and still further, it happens to be at random. So your opponent doesn't have the chance to pick their most ineffectual or situationally useless card, but they run the risk of getting rid of something they might have been holding on to make all the difference during some decisive battle, or it might be some extraordinarily dangerous unit, an event that could make an enormous difference to the outcome of the game, or it might be some sort of nasty trick that they've been waiting to deploy against you. Plus, the fewer cards your opponent happens to have in their hand, the more likely you are to get rid of something potentially powerful that they've been holding on to. And if you're able to play multiple copies of this event, up to the 2 in your deck in the same turn, then your opponent runs a still greater risk of getting rid of something good. Certainly, the additional cost of having to sacrifice a unit can, at times, be difficult to bear, but considering that Packmaster Kith by herself is putting a Chimera token into play each and every round, and we've mentioned a host of other different card effects that allows you to generate multiple units, whether it's a Chimera Masters or a Beast Hunter Witches, both of which have different means of generating additional sacrificable token units for you. Hopefully you'll ultimately have a number of different options when it comes to having to sacrifice a unit. And really, whenever you happen to draw and play this event, it has the potential of being extremely beneficial to you. At the very least, it draws you a couple cards, and at the very best, it might just end up forcing your opponent to discard the linchpin of their deck. And even though you have to play this event during the deployment phase, when you ultimately choose to do so is a huge aspect of the strategy inherent to this card. For instance, if you're worried about your opponent playing some sort of resource-intensive, enormous, nasty units, maybe you want to play this early. Or, if you're waiting for your opponent to leverage some sort of last-minute nasty event or other trick against you, maybe it instead makes even more sense to wait until as late as possible to deploy this event. And seeing as how you might be able to play up to 2 copies of this card per turn, if you can also play 1 or more copies of Murder of Razor Wings, you can potentially decimate your opponent's hand. And if you can force them to discard as many cards as they're holding, whether they're random or not, you might be able to take away each and every option for what kind of effect or army unit your opponent could possibly hope to leverage against you. And, as with any other Dark Eldar event, this not only confers the benefits we've already discussed, but it also plays perfectly well into that Beast Hunter Witches synergy to generate more and more Chimera tokens for you, and along those same lines, you're certainly welcome to deploy Colosseum Fighters in order to return this to your hand, just to guarantee as many opportunities to force your opponent to discard cards as possible. And if you're really interested in running a discard type deck to frustrate your opponent by forcing them to expend as many cards as they can without any kind of benefit, you could also make use of the Eldar ally Bealtan Warp Spiders in order to force them to discard even more cards, this time off the top of their deck, and unlike this event, allowing you some small degree of choice in what it is you're forcing your opponent to discard. But in any case, whether you're able to play one copy of this event, both copies of this event, with or without the accompaniment of Razor Wings during any given deployment phase, and considering, too, the possibility of using those Colosseum fighters to play one copy of this event multiple times during the same game round, this event nevertheless has the potential of proving to be an enormous headache for your opponent. So, taken all together, not only does Packmaster Kith possess the uncanny ability to fill the board with fragile, expendable, albeit exceptionally deadly Chimera tokens, as well as the capability of concentrating them at specific planets where they can make the absolute biggest difference in helping to determine the outcome of decisive battles, but she can also take advantage of a host of enormously frustrating Dark Eldar discard and harassment type events and effects. For all of these reasons I've explained in this video, and so many more that are yet to come once I make the Dark Eldar faction video, Packmaster Kith, as has been proven in the tournament scene throughout the world, certainly seems to be an exceptionally formidable warlord. So as always, thank you for joining me during this overview of Packmaster Kith and her signature squad. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already. Please do me a favor and leave a comment below if you have any devious tips and tricks for Packmaster Kith or any of her signature squad that you'd like to share. Or if you have any gameplay experiences, be they piloting this warlord or squaring off against her. But with that said, let's bring this video to a close, and I'll see you again soon.